Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we continue our study of Sefer Mishlei, the book of Proverbs, with chapter 16. Chapter 16 is interesting for many reasons. The main reason being that in the first series of verses, I think it's about 10, the name of God is repeated over and over again, which is unusual. I mean, God's name, of course, has appeared in Mishlei, but to be so consistently referring to God, and therefore the focus then is on our relationship with and our experience with God, as opposed to just, I shouldn't say just, because they're quite important, but issues of wisdom and how to live our lives between fellow human beings. So, and we'll point that out as we go through this. And also, and in the first half of chapter 16, which we're going to be studying together today in this podcast, there's the verses which reference God, which I just referred to, and then there's a series of verses which discuss a king or a leader, and either how he behaves or how he should behave, and the difference between those two, and we'll talk about when we get there. So those are two issues, two kind of series of verses which we're going to deal with today. So let's get into it. Li Adam ma'archei leiv u'mei Adonai ma'anei lashon. This is a verse that many of listeners may be very familiar with from the liturgy of the high holidays in the prayer, Ochila Lakel. I supplicate before God. It's something which the leader, the Shliach Tzibor, the cantor says in the beginning, of the repetition of Shmona Esrei. It's a statement of humility, and basically what the words mean is L'odam marchei leiv. The person is responsible for, or can, or does arrange things within his heart. He arranges and sets upon his ideas within his soul. That is the person's responsibility, is one way of looking at it, or this is the thing that the person does. Umei Hashem, but it is from God that ma'anei lashon, that which his tongue speaks, is one way it's translated. But I am going to go with the Mitzudos and the Malbim that seem to understand this very differently, and that is that ma'anei lashon, the word ma'anei means how something is responded to, how something is answered, how the lashon is received by others. So in other words, you can set up the best speech in the world, but how it is received by others, that is a gift from God, right? In other words, and this is true in a lot of what we do in life. We can arrange things, we can plan things, and we're going to see this theme repeated in different ways throughout this chapter, which is one of the reasons why I think this is a good translation here. And that is, but how our speech is received. There are so many other conditions that can affect the way what we say is received. We may have the best intentions, but our speeches can either fall flat or sometimes can have the opposite effect of what we wanted. One example I'm thinking of is this person has a very serious talk and they want to convey seriously, and then someone in the audience stands up and jeers or makes a joke, or it just ruins the entire atmosphere. And that is out of the speaker's control. You may have the best speech, but how it gets received, that is something that is outside the person's control. Kol darchei ish zach bi'einav. And this verse 2 is very familiar to all of us. All of the ways of a person are pure in his own eyes. We always think, we think of ourselves always as being right. We always think that what we do and what we think or what we say is with the right intention. We have all kinds of ways of explaining ourselves to ourselves. V'tochein ruchot Adonai, but it is God who knows and understands the true inner spirit that is within our souls. He knows whether we are really mean well or not. This verse is very deep, very profound, and of course something that we can all should think about. God knows the real deal, whether or not we really do mean well or whether or not maybe we don't. And it's something for us to think about. In other words, no matter how honest we think we're being with ourselves, a truly objective look in our own souls is a very difficult challenge. Gol el Adonai ma'asecha v'yikonu machshavosecha. How does one get about accomplishing the first two challenges, the challenges of verse 1 and the challenges of verse 2? Well, verse 3 comes in and tells us exactly how to get past those challenges. The challenges of having the best intentions, planning a great speech, but then how do we make sure it gets received? The challenge of how do we know that what we're doing is truly right and we're not just convincing ourselves that it's right? Well, if one gives over to God one's actions, one does things with the right intention, rather than for our own aggrandizement, rather than for our own benefit, rather than for our own selfish needs. We do it for the proper intentions, then v'yikonu machshavosecha, then your thoughts will be successful in practice. So verse 3 is really telling us a guide on how to get around and get past the problems that were mentioned in verses 1 and 2. Kol pa'al Adonai lema'anehu. Everything that God does is for His purpose. Now, lema'anehu means for His purpose, but this could be read in two ways, which gives this verse very different meaning. If we look at Rashi and Mitzudos and other classic commentaries, they understand this, that everything that God does, He has His own purpose, His own reason for that action. We may not understand it, we may not see it, but there is a reason, and that reason is always for God's own purpose. Vigam rasha liyom ra'ah, and even a evil person on his day where he does evil, that also has its purpose, and God's purpose, which we may not understand. That is one way of understanding verse 4, and one clearly legitimate way, of course, doesn't need me to say that, of understanding and translating this verse. But there's another way of understanding Lemahanehu, which gives a kind of a different twist, and that would be the Ralbag, the Gersonides, and he follows in a similar way that Maimonides translates this, and that is that everything that God creates is for its purpose. Remember, in Hebrew, there is no difference between it and he, right? Lemanehu could mean it could mean he, right? Is for its own purpose. In other words, every single thing that is created in this world, everything that God did is for its own purpose. And also, right, a Rasha, even the evil person, right, he was created for his purpose. The evil things that we see around us are also here for their own existence, which is also another deep way of understanding it, which we can discuss for a long time. But unfortunately, this podcast only allows for a certain amount of time to spend on each and every verse, but definitely something to think about and something to spend time thinking about. It's almost a shame to read so many verses in such a short period of time, because each and every one is just jam-packed with something to meditate over. To'avat Adonai kol giva lev. What is an abomination to God is anyone who is arrogant in his soul. Yod li yod lo yinakeh. From hand to hand, and using Rashi's translation of this, God directly from hand to hand, right, from God's hand to your own hand, lo yinakeh, He will not look past this. He will not just ignore arrogance. Other things, maybe He'll give you a pass, but arrogance is an abomination to God, and He's not going to give you a pass. Yad liyad can also be understood as a way of saying assuredly or absolutely, right? Kind of like saying, I'll raise my right hand, right? To testify that this is absolute. There's no way you're going to get away with gevalev, with arrogance of the heart. And of course, this gives us an understanding of how we relate to God. Remember, like I said, all these verses that keep mentioning God's name and our relationship to Him, we have the power to think, we have the power to plan, but it is in God's hand to make sure to make our plans either successful or unsuccessful. How does one do that? Right? Rely on God, like we said in verse 3. Get rid of our own arrogance, like we're saying now in verse 5. Understand that everything is for its own purpose, as we said in verse 4. Nothing is created not for no reason. It's not here for us. It's here for itself, each and everything that exists in this world. B'chesed ve'emes yichupar avon. If you have kindness and truth, right? If that's how you live, with kindness and with truth, then God will be yichupar avon. He will allow sin to be forgiven. In other words, I just said before, arrogance, right? Lo yinakeh, will not be cleansed. But if you're kind and you seek the truth, then you can get forgiveness for your sins, right? That's the opposite of a gevalev. That's the opposite of an arrogant person. Uviyirat Adonai, and one who has awe of God, sur meira, he will turn away from evil. Turning away from evil, which is necessary in order to receive forgiveness for our sins, one must turn away from evil, and one does that with chesed, with emes, and yira, with awe of God, which is the opposite of arrogance. Right, that is what leads to humility. We've spoken about that repeatedly over and over again, and that is how one can achieve forgiveness. Birtzos Adonai darchei ish, gam oivav yashlim ito. When God is pleased, is happy with the ways of man, in other words, when He sees you living those things which I just mentioned, then a person will find peace. Even his enemies will make peace with him, right? Because when a person lives with kindness, with truth, with humility, in this way, it is possible to achieve peace. Peace can only come through chesed, through emes, through truth, through kindness, through humility. That is how one achieves peace with one's enemies, not through overpowering them, not through acting in an inappropriate way. Tov ma'at bitzdaka. It is much better. You think you might achieve a lot by being a tough guy, by being mean, by overpowering others, by taking advantage of others. But no, if you do things with righteousness and you gain a little bit, that is much better. Meirov tuvuros, from all kinds of benefit or income below mishpat, which one gets through an unjust way, right? You might see, but that guy, he used the power, the might of his gun, his muscles to get all of these things. He might have gotten all of this, but what he has is nowhere near as valuable as the little bit that you gained in a righteous, just, proper, and true way. Leiv Adon michashev darko. A person makes all kinds of plans out his ways, but it is God that prepares and makes his footsteps successful. And again, this is very similar to the idea which we started with, the famous Yiddish phrase, a Mensch Tracht und Gott lacht. A person thinks, but God laughs. In other words, we make our plans, right, as we should make our plans. But whether our plans will be successful, that depends on factors that are out of our control and only in God's control. Now that's the end. Those first 9 verses are the verses which reference our relationship with God and mention God's name over and over again. The next series of several verses focus on a king. Now, understandably, the commentaries understand this in many different ways. We can look at Rashi, who often understands this king to be referring to God, the ultimate king, and he interprets the verses accordingly. We can also see those who understand this as a description of a king, and those, especially medieval times, who thought of a king as an absolute monarch, would have understood those verses differently in ways that don't quite ring well in our ears today. The way of understanding these verses that I am going to stick with begins with an understanding of the Eben Ezra on verse 10, and but the Eben Ezra doesn't completely carry it through to all the verses that follow, 11, 12, 13, etc. But there's a in the Sansino edition, which was published in the 1940s and then several times in decades after that by a rabbi or a Reverend Dr. Abraham Cohen, who and he translates these verses this way, and I just think it's such a beautiful understanding of the verses. I mean, and as I said, the basis comes from the way the Eben Ezra understands this first verse. And I'll explain what I mean in a second. Let me read the verse, and then I'll explain what I mean. Kesem al sifsei melech. There is magic on the lips of a king. B'mishpat lo yimal piv. His mouth will not make a mistake in justice. Now, if this is a descriptor of the kings in general, then that would, which is one way of understanding it, that would really kind of hurt hard, because lots of kings aren't exactly magic in their justice, unless one says, well, the king, whatever the king does is God's will, but that brings up a lot of theological questions, which I'm not going to deal with here. But if one understands it, so the Eben Ezra says he uses the language Ya'ut liyot al sifsei melech. It is appropriate for a king to have his lips work like magic, right? And mishpat lo yimal piv, and not rebel against justice. In other words, this is advice to a king. And if one understands these verses as advice to a king, as opposed to a statement, a descriptor of a king, that completely changes the understanding of this verse and the following verses. And I'm going to go with this because it takes something which you can learn a lot from, of course, but it brings up challenges, theological challenges, moral, ethical challenges. But if one reads it this way, then it is just absolutely astoundingly beautiful, and that's the way I'm sticking with. So, Kasem al sifsei melech means there should be magic, right? If you are a king, or as most of the commentaries understand, it's not just a king. This could be anyone to whom the arbitration of justice was responsible for the arbitration of justice. Anyone who is in that position, he should be like magic, and he should never, ever rebel against justice. Lo yimal, the language here, yimal could mean a mistake, right? But yimal is also the language that the Torah uses to describe me'ilah, which is profaning something that's holy, right? So don't profane justice. Don't rebel against justice. Right? That is the kind of king, that is the kind of arbiter of justice, anyone in that position, which includes all of us, and many times. Peles umozne mishpat ladonai ma'aseu kol avnekis. That's verse 11. Now, there's, of course, lots of ways to translate and understand this, but the way we've been reading verse 10, we're going to read verse 11, continuing that path, right? That Peles, the honest, the scales and honest balances, right? Those are God's, right? It is all of these stones that one finds in one's bag, the measuring stones, are His creation. What that means then is, if we read it the way we're reading it, is when this king is arbitrating over a case of justice and making decisions about how to treat people that are under his command, or that come to him to arbitrate, to come to him to judge, right? He has to recognize and understand that ultimate justice, the rules of justice, the scales of justice, are God's. One cannot make it up as he goes along and decide, I'm going to apply these rules here and these rules here and these rules here. Mishpat, the Peles umozne mishpat, are God's, right? That is what a king needs to remember. He needs to understand that all of the avnei kis, all of the different measurements in his bag, are Masehu, are God's measurements. He's the one who, so when we decide justice, we need to remember the importance. It's not something that you can just make up as you go along. There is such a thing as real justice. There is an inherent system of moral justice which that king needs to be consistent with. The king or all of us. To'avat milachim. It is this is an abomination of kings asos resha, when he does evil. Again, this just supports this Reverend Cohen's understanding, and I think it's a slam dunk that this is what the verses actually mean, right? Because again, it's telling us about what kind of king is a good one and what kind is a bad one, how to be a good king and how to be a bad one when it comes to administering justice. To'avat milachim, it is an abomination when one does evil. Ki vitzdaka yikon kisei, how does one establish a throne? How does one establish oneself as a good, successful kon, meaning established and successful, right? That is with tzedakah, that is with righteousness. Ritzon milachim, what makes a king loved, what makes a king favored by people? Sifsei tzedek, it is lips that speak justice. Vidover yisharim, it is the one who speaks straight, who speaks consistent, who speaks honestly. Yehav, that he is the one who will be loved. Chamat melech, but when a king gets angry and he metes out justice in anger, malachei maves, that is like the angel of death. That is a terrible thing. That king is a destructive king. He is a king who is like a malach hamaves, v'ish chacham michaperena. And a smart man, now this could mean a smart man who is in the presence of the king, yichaperena, will calm him down, will appease that anger. But actually, I think it doesn't mean that. I think the ish chacham refers to the king himself. Yichaperena, if he is a smart king, he will calm down his anger so that he does not act out of anger. When he gets angry, he won't pronounce his decisions when he's angry. He will calm himself down first. Bi'or pnei melech chayim. Right? When a king is or pnei melech, when his face is lit up, when his face is smiling, that is when he is a source of life to those that are under him. Uritzono ke'ov malkosh, and his favor and the is like that when he favors something, right? Ke'ov malkosh is like a rain that gives life. Right, the cloud, rain cloud, which gives life in the springtime. Right, Malkosh is the season of spring rain. Now, Ritzono, we just said in verse 13, what is Ritzono? What is the Ratzon, the favor of the king? It's Siftzei Tzedek. Right, we just said Ritzon Melachim Siftzei Tzedek. The Ritzon of kings, the favor of a king, is when he speaks with lips of righteousness. So then over here in verse 15, Ritzono, right, meaning when he speaks righteousness, K'av Malkosh, that is like the rain of springtime. That gives Chaim, that gives life to those that are under his charge. When he speaks with kindness, when he speaks with mercy, when he has or pnei melech, when the king is lit up with a smile, as opposed to the king who speaks out of anger, who ends up being a source of death for his subjects. He's a malach hamaves, he is an angel of death. Kino chachma. I mean, actually, even though I wanted to go one or two more verses just so that it's kind of half of the chapter, but this is the end of that series on the king. And so we had these two series, the one about the relationship between man and God, and the second series being verses about a king. From next verse 16 is where I'm going to start the next podcast. It kind of goes back to this more familiar pattern of Mishlei with, one proverb after another in each verse, which they are connected, but they don't have the same kind of themes that the last sets of verses had that we studied together. So I'll stop here. This will end 16a. I hope you enjoyed it. I welcome very much any comments. If you'd like to email me directly, it's weinrebsaul@gmail.com. That's weinrebsaul@gmail.com. Or please, I encourage you to respond to me on any of the public forums that are out there where this podcast appears, and I will do my best to respond to them. Have a wonderful, wonderful day, and thank you again for participating.